Men die for gold until their hands bleed, completely blind to the real treasure sitting right in front of them. Ethan Cole owned the mountain. At 35 years old, he owned the timber, the silver veins cutting through the rock, and the very town nestled in its shadow. But wealth only bought him liars. So he traded his tailored coat for frayed wool and walked into the valley with empty pockets. He wanted a woman who would look at a beggar and see a man. Wind howled down the canyon, carrying the bitter scent of wet pine and coal smoke. Ethan Cole pulled the collar of his moth-eaten coat tighter around his neck. The wool scratched at his jaw, smelling faintly of wet dog and damp earth. It was a far cry from the imported silk and fine broadcloth hanging in the cedar closets of his estate 3,000 feet above. Up there, the fires burned hot and the whiskey poured smooth. Down here, the mud sucked at his worn boots with every step. He walked into the settlement of Pine Hollow, just as the afternoon sun abandoned the valley, casting long gray shadows over the false front buildings. Wagons rattled past, splashing freezing muck against his trousers. No one apologized. No one even looked at him. To the miners, loggers, and merchants of Pine Hollow, he was just another stray dog looking for scraps. That was exactly what he wanted. Ethan had spent 35 years building an empire out of rock and timber. He had crushed rivals, bought politicians, and amassed a fortune that made bank managers sweat. And it had left him entirely hollow. The women who smiled at him in Denver and San Francisco looked at his ledger, not his face. They loved the carriage, the estate, the name. They did not love Ethan. He was tired of being a walking vault. He wanted to know what a man was worth when his pockets were empty. He pushed through the swinging doors of the Iron Horse Saloon. The heat hit him first, followed by the sour stench of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Men sat hunched over faro tables, throwing away their wages. A piano player hammered out a tinny tune in the corner. Ethan walked to the end of the bar. He kept his shoulders slumped, hiding the broad, thick build earned from years of swinging a pickaxe before he owned the mine. He let his hair fall into his eyes. "What do you want, tramp?" The barkeep did not look up from wiping down a spilled pint. "A bowl of stew," Ethan rasped, pitching his voice low and scraping his throat to sound raw. "Whatever is cheapest." The barkeep finally looked up, taking in the frayed hat, the dirt smudged across Ethan's cheek, the split leather of his boots. He sneered. "Stew is 20 cents. You got 20 cents? Ethan patted his pockets slowly. "Might be I can chop some wood out back, wash the plates." "We are not a charity. Get out before I throw you out." Ethan did not move. He let his gaze drift over the room, watching the patrons avert their eyes. A miner next to him scooted his stool away as if poverty were a disease he might catch. "You deaf?" The barkeep reached under the counter. "Leave him be, Tom." The voice cut through the low rumble of the saloon. It was not loud, but it carried a quiet authority. Ethan turned. She stood near the kitchen doors, holding a stack of empty tin plates. Her dress was faded blue cotton, mended at the elbows and frayed at the hem. An apron stained with flour and grease covered her front. Her hands were red and raw from lye soap and hot water. But her eyes, they were a clear, striking amber, tired but sharp. "I said leave him be," she repeated, stepping forward. She set the heavy plates on the bar. "There is half a pot of yesterday's beef scrap left. It is only going to the hogs. He is not paying Laura." Tom barked. "Owner says no freebies. I will cover his 20 cents, she said flatly. Ethan watched her. She did not look at him with pity. She did not look at him with disgust. She just looked at him like he was a human being who was cold. "Suit yourself," Tom muttered, walking away. "Your funeral when you come up short for your own rent." Laura ignored him. She vanished into the kitchen and returned a minute later with a chipped ceramic bowl steaming in her hands. She set it on a small table near the hearth, away from the crowded bar. "Sit," she told Ethan. He walked over, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He sat down. The stew was mostly potatoes and gristle, but to a man who had walked 10 miles down a mountain in freezing rain, it smelled like heaven. "Thank you, ma'am," Ethan said. "Eat it while it is hot," Laura said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And do not mind Tom. He has a heart the size of a dried pea." She turned to walk away, but a loud, booming laugh from the front of the saloon stopped her. The doors banged open. Rex Dalton strode in, flanked by 2 ranch hands. Rex was a man who wore his money, loud silver spurs, a custom-tooled gun belt, and a beaver felt hat that cost more than most men made in a month. He was Pine Hollow's biggest cattle buyer, and he acted like he owned the dirt beneath the floorboards. Ethan actually did own the dirt, but he stayed silent, spooning the hot stew into his mouth. Rex's eyes landed on Laura. A predatory smile stretched across his face. "Laura girl," Rex called out, crossing the room and catching her by the elbow. "You are looking prettier than a painted picture. When are you going to quit pouring slop for these vagrants and let me take you to Denver?" Laura pulled her arm out of his grip. Her jaw tightened. "I am working, Rex." "You are always working." Rex sighed, leaning against the bar. "Your daddy left you nothing but a rotten boarding house and a pile of debts. Sell the place to me. I will clear the debt, and you can live comfortable." "The boarding house is not for sale," she said softly, though Ethan could hear the tremor of exhaustion in her voice. "Suit yourself. But the bank is going to come calling eventually. They always do." Rex glanced toward the hearth and finally noticed Ethan. His nose wrinkled. Good Lord. Did a corpse drag itself in here? What is that smell? A few men at the bar chuckled. Ethan kept his eyes on his bowl, methodically eating his stew. He memorized Rex's face. He memorized the cruel laugh. "He is a paying customer," Laura said sharply. "With what dirt?" Rex stepped closer to Ethan's table. He nudged Ethan's worn boot with his silver spur. "Hey, you know you are tracking mud on a floor decent folks walk on." Ethan slowly lowered his spoon. He looked up, his eyes cold and dark as flint, locked onto Rex's. For a fraction of a second, the mountain man slipped, and the ruthless tycoon stared through the rags. Rex flinched, taking a half step back before catching himself. Before Ethan could speak, Laura stepped between them. "Leave him alone, Rex, or I will get the sheriff." Rex scoffed, recovering his bravado. "Sheriff is just a name, Laura, but fine. I do not want to lose my appetite." He turned away, throwing a silver dollar on the bar. "Whiskey Tom, pour it from the good bottle." Laura let out a slow, shaky breath. She looked down at Ethan. "Finish your food," she whispered. "Then you best move on. Rex is not a man you want noticing you." Ethan looked at her hands. The knuckles were chapped and bleeding. He looked at her tired, beautiful face. "I am not going nowhere," Ethan said quietly. For 3 days, Ethan lived like a ghost in the margins of Pine Hollow. He slept in the hayloft of a sympathetic stablemaster who let him stay in exchange for mucking out the stalls before dawn. The work was brutal. The ammonia burned his nose, and the heavy pitchfork left blisters on his palms and hands that had grown soft over the past decade of signing contracts rather than breaking rock. But Ethan welcomed the ache. It grounded him. It reminded him of who he was before the money. During the day, he loitered near the mercantile or chopped firewood for pennies. He watched the town. More importantly, he watched Laura Harper. She ran a dilapidated 2-story boarding house at the end of Main Street. The roof sagged, the paint was peeling in long, ugly strips, and the front porch had a permanent list to the left. She rented rooms to transient miners and railroad workers, sweeping their dirt, washing their sheets, and cooking their meals. She was up before the sun and worked until the moon was high. Ethan learned quickly that her father had died in a mine collapse 2 years prior, leaving her with a crippling mortgage held by the local bank. And the bank manager, Ethan knew for a fact, was firmly in the pocket of Rex Dalton. Rex was squeezing her. He wanted the property, and he wanted her, and he did not care which one broke first. On the fourth morning, a bitter frost coated the mud in a brittle white crust. Ethan walked up the street carrying his axe. He stopped across from Laura's boarding house. She was on the front porch, wrapped in a thin shawl, trying to nail a loose floorboard back into place. Her hands were numb. The hammer slipped, striking the wood with a dull thud. She dropped her head, her shoulders shaking in the cold. Ethan crossed the street. His heavy boots crunched on the frost. Laura looked up, wiping her nose with the back of her wrist. She squinted, recognizing the ragged coat and the heavy beard. "You are still here," she said. "I am," Ethan replied. He set his axe down. "You are holding that hammer wrong. You keep choking up on the grip. You will tear your elbow out." She looked at the hammer, then back at him. "I can manage." "Did not say you could not, just said it hurts more than it has to." Ethan walked up the steps. The wood groaned under his weight. "Let me. I do not have money to pay you. I did not ask for money. Nobody works for free." She eyed him with a mixture of suspicion and exhaustion. The cynicism of the town had worn off on her, even if the cruelty had not. "I need a roof over my head," Ethan said smoothly, falling into his lie. "Stable is getting too cold at night. I figure you have empty rooms. I can fix that porch patch, the roof, chop a cord of wood. In exchange, I get a cot in the back room and 2 meals a day." Laura hesitated. She looked at the porch, which was dangerously close to collapsing, and then at Ethan. He looked rough-wild even, but there was a steadiness in his posture. "The back room is barely a closet," she warned. "It is drafty." "Better than the street." She sighed, the tension bleeding out of her shoulders. She held out the hammer. "All right." "My name is Laura." "Ethan." He took the hammer. Their fingers brushed. Hers were freezing. For the next week, Ethan worked. He did not just fix the porch. He tore out the rotten joists and rebuilt it from the mud up. He climbed onto the steep pitch of the roof and patched the leaks, his muscles burning in the biting wind. He chopped enough wood to last her through the winter, stacking it in perfectly neat, tight cords against the back of the house. He stayed out of the way of her paying boarders. He ate his meals in the kitchen, sitting on a 3-legged stool near the stove. Laura would sit at the small table, going over her ledger, the stub of a pencil moving frantically across the paper. She frowned constantly, rubbing her temples. One evening, after the boarders had gone up to sleep, Ethan sat near the stove, whittling a piece of pine. Laura was at the table, her head in her hands. "Numbers do not change just because you stare at them hard." Ethan murmured, not looking up from his knife. Laura gave a dry, humorless laugh. "If I stare hard enough, maybe I will find the missing $10 for the banknote." Ethan stopped whittling. $10. Up on the mountain, he tipped carriage drivers $10. He drank whiskey that cost $50 a bottle. The utter absurdity of it twisted in his gut. He could pull a gold piece from the hidden lining of his boot and solve her problem instantly. But if he did that, the illusion would break. He would just be another man trying to buy her. "Bank pushing you?" he asked. "Rex is pushing the bank," she corrected softly. She closed the ledger. "He wants this land. He wants to tear down the boarding house and build a supply depot for his cattle operation. And he thinks if he makes me desperate enough, I will marry him just to keep from starving." "Would you—" Laura looked up. Her amber eyes flashed with sudden, fierce pride. "I would rather eat dirt." Ethan smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had worn in years. It changed his face, softening the harsh lines of his jaw and bringing a warmth to his dark eyes, Laura noticed. She stared at him for a moment, catching her breath. "You do not look like a drifter when you smile," she said quietly. "What do I look like?" "Like a man who knows a secret." She stood up, walking over to the stove to check the kettle. "Where did you come from, Ethan?" "You work harder than any man I have seen. But your hands, the calluses were fresh when you got here. You have not been doing manual labor your whole life." Ethan looked at his palms. The blisters had popped and hardened into thick yellow ridges. "I had a different life before this," he said. It was the truth. Lost it. Decided to start walking. Ended up here. "I am sorry," she said. She poured a cup of hot water and handed it to him. "Losing what you built, it takes a piece of your soul." She spoke with such profound empathy that Ethan felt a sharp stab of guilt. He had lied to her. He was playing a game with her reality. But as he took the warm cup from her hands, he knew he could not stop. Not yet. He needed to know how deep this went. Winter hit Pine Hollow like a hammer. The snow came down in thick, blinding sheets, burying the town under 2 feet of powder. The mines slowed down, and the men drank more. Tempers flared. Ethan spent his days reinforcing the windows and sealing drafts in the boarding house. The work kept him close to Laura. They developed a quiet rhythm. He would haul the water, she would boil it. He would split the wood, she would keep the fire fed. They rarely spoke of the future, living only in the immediate survival of the present day. Ethan watched how she treated people. When an old miner could not pay his rent, Laura told him to fix the back gate and called it even. When a stray dog wandered onto the porch, she gave it half of her own breakfast. She was tired, she was broke, and she was relentlessly, stubbornly kind. The contrast between her and the women Ethan used to know was staggering. The society ladies in Denver wore their charity like jewelry, parading it around at galas. Laura hid her charity, acting as if kindness was a basic obligation, not a virtue to be celebrated. Ethan was falling in love. It was not the fiery, reckless infatuation of his youth. It was a slow, heavy settling in his chest, like a massive stone locking into a foundation. He wanted to build a life around her. He wanted to give her the world. But he held back. He needed her to choose the man with nothing. On a Tuesday afternoon, the front door of the boarding house crashed open. Snow blew into the hallway, followed by Rex Dalton. He stomped his expensive boots on the floorboards, shaking snow from his heavy bear fur coat. 2 of his men lingered on the porch. Laura stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Ethan stood quietly in the doorway behind her, an iron fireplace poker resting casually in his right hand. "Rex," Laura said, her voice tight. "Shut the door. You are letting the heat out." Rex kicked the door shut. He did not take off his hat. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and slapped it against the banister. "Notice from the bank," Rex said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You are 30 days past due on the interest, Laura. Foreclosing. Sheriff is coming to serve the papers formally tomorrow." Laura went pale. The towel slipped from her hands, landing softly on the floor. "No, I spoke to Mr. Higgins. He said I had until spring. Higgins sold the note to me." Rex smirked. "And I do not feel like waiting until spring. I want my money, Laura. $300 by noon tomorrow." It was a death sentence. $300 might as well have been $1 million to her. "You planned this," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage and despair. "I am a businessman," Rex said smoothly. He took a step towards her, his voice dropping into a sickening purr. "But I am not a monster. I will tear up the note right now. I will forgive the whole debt. You just have to pack your bags and move into my house up on the ridge. Be my wife, you will never scrub another floor." Laura stared at him. The silence in the hallway was suffocating. Ethan tightened his grip on the iron poker. His knuckles turned white. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears. "Say no," he prayed silently. "Say no, and I will ruin him." "I told you before," Laura said, her chin lifting, her amber eyes burning through the tears. "I would rather eat dirt." Rex's face flushed ugly and red. His mask of charm vanished. "You stupid, stubborn girl. You will be sleeping in the snow tomorrow." He lunged forward, grabbing her roughly by the wrist. Ethan moved. He did not run. He stepped forward with frightening, explosive speed. Before Rex could even register the movement, Ethan's hand clamped around Rex's throat. Ethan slammed the wealthy rancher backward into the heavy oak front door. The wood cracked under the impact. Rex gasped, his hands flying up to claw at Ethan's grip, but Ethan's arm was like an iron bar. "Take your hand off her," Ethan growled. His voice was not the raspy drawl of a drifter anymore. It was the cold, flat tone of a man accustomed to giving orders that resulted in violence. Rex choked, his eyes bulging. His two men outside shouted and started to throw their shoulders against the door, but Ethan's massive frame held it shut. "You filthy," Rex spat, trying to kick out. Ethan applied a fraction more pressure to the windpipe. Rex gagged. "If you ever touch her again," Ethan whispered, leaning in so only Rex could hear, "I will not just kill you, I will dismantle you. I will take your land, your cattle, and your name, and I will burn it all to ash. Do you understand me?" Rex stared into Ethan's eyes. He did not see a beggar. He saw a predator. The rancher nodded frantically, terror overriding his pride. Ethan released him and stepped back, letting his shoulders slump again, slipping the mask back on. Rex scrambled away from the door, coughing and rubbing his neck. He yanked the door open, stumbling out onto the porch with his men. "You are dead, tramp," Rex rasped, safely behind his hired guns. "Both of you tomorrow at noon. The sheriff throws you in the street." He turned and fled into the snow. The silence returned to the hallway, broken only by the howling wind outside. Laura stood frozen, staring at Ethan. Her chest heaved. Ethan carefully set the iron poker against the wall. He did not look at her. He expected fear. He expected her to demand he leave. Instead, she stepped toward him. She reached out her trembling fingers, gently touching his bruised knuckles. "You should not have done that," she whispered. "He will kill you, Ethan." "He can try." "You need to leave," she pleaded, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "Pack your things tonight. Sneak out before dawn. I cannot let you die from my mistakes." Ethan looked down at her. She had just lost everything. Her home, her livelihood, her father's legacy, and her only concern in that moment was the safety of a penniless drifter she had known for 3 weeks. The test was over. She was exactly what he had prayed for. Ethan reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. "I am not going anywhere, Laura," he said softly, "and neither are you. Go to sleep. Let me worry about tomorrow." Morning broke over Pine Hollow like a bruised eye, purple and swollen with the promise of more snow. Laura woke to a freezing room and an empty house. She walked downstairs, her worn soles soft against the silent floorboards. The fire in the kitchen stove was dead. The heavy iron poker sat precisely where it had been left the night before. Ethan was gone. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for women who had someone to catch their tears. She had expected him to run. Rex was a dangerous, vindictive man, and Ethan was just a drifter with a heavy swing and empty pockets. Survival dictated flight in the West. Still, a bitter ache settled deep beneath her ribs, a hollow space she had not realized he had filled so completely in just 3 weeks. She touched the rim of the chipped mug he had drank from the night before. It was ice cold. She had until noon. Laura pulled her father's leather satchel from beneath her bed. She packed methodically, A quilt her mother had stitched before the cholera took her. Her father's brass pocket watch, broken and frozen at 4 o'clock. 2 faded dresses, a tintype photograph of her family standing in front of the boarding house when the paint was fresh and the future felt possible. 30 years of Harper history boiled down to 20 pounds of canvas and leather. By 11:30, the sky had cleared, leaving a blinding, terrible glare on the snow. Laura carried her satchel to the front porch. She sat on the top step, the wood Ethan had meticulously repaired just days prior. Men began to gather on the fringes of the street. Cowards. They stood near the mercantile and the saloon, whispering behind their collars, waiting to watch a woman break. At 11:45, Rex Dalton rode up the street. He was not alone. He brought Sheriff Higgins, a man whose badge was practically bought and paid for with Rex's cattle money, and 3 ranch hands holding lever-action rifles across their saddles. Rex dismounted, his boots crunching loudly on the packed ice. He wore a brand-new coyote hide coat, looking every bit the conquering king of a mud-soaked kingdom. "Time is up, Laura," Rex called out, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He glanced around the empty porch, a sneer twisting his lips. "Where is your attack dog? Figured out how to run, did he?" "He had nothing to do with this," Laura said. Her voice was steady even as her hands trembled inside her pockets. "The debt is mine." "Was yours," Rex corrected. He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket and handed it to the sheriff. "It is my property now. Higgins, do your job." Sheriff Higgins looked down at the snow, unable to meet Laura's amber eyes. "Ma'am, by order of the county magistrate, you are ordered to vacate the premises. The deed transfers to Mr. Dalton immediately." "I have my things," Laura said, standing up. She picked up her satchel. She refused to let Rex see her break. She would walk out of this town with her spine straight. Not so fast. Rex stepped onto the first stair, blocking her path. His eyes ran over her, hungry and cruel. "You owe $300. That bag does not look like it holds $300. Leave it. Everything inside this house pays your interest." "These are my family's things," Laura said, her composure finally cracking, panic bleeding into her chest. "They have no value to you. They have value to me if you want them." Rex smiled. "Now drop it, or Higgins throws you in a cell for theft of my property." Laura clutched the bag to her chest. She looked at the sheriff, pleading silently, but Higgins just shifted his weight and looked away. The crowd across the street watched in total silence. She was entirely alone. A sharp, rhythmic sound shattered the quiet. It was not the sloppy plodding of a ranch horse. It was the synchronized heavy thud of 4 massive draft horses. The crowd parted instantly. A custom-built carriage rolled down Main Street. The woodwork was polished mahogany, the metal trim gleaming brass. It was a vehicle that belonged on the paved avenues of New York, not the rutted muck of Pine Hollow. The driver hauled back on the reins, and the massive black Percherons came to a halt directly behind Rex's men. Rex turned around, his irritation flashing into confusion. Nobody in the valley owned a carriage like that. The door swung open. A man stepped out into the snow. He wore a tailored charcoal broadcloth suit, a heavy cashmere overcoat, and boots made of polished Spanish leather. A silver chain draped across his vest, catching the harsh winter sunlight. His beard was trimmed down to a neat, jaw-hugging line, but the shoulders were the same, broad, heavy, forged by a pickaxe. The dark, flinty eyes were exactly the same. Laura dropped her satchel. It hit the porch with a heavy thud. Ethan walked past the ranch hands. They parted for him instinctively, sensing the apex predator in the room. He did not look at Rex. He walked straight to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. He looked up at Laura. "I told you I was not going anywhere," Ethan said quietly. Rex barked a harsh, confused laugh. What kind of circus trick is this? You steal some rich man's clothes, I will have Higgins hang you for a thief right here. Ethan finally turned his head. He looked at Rex with the utter detached boredom a man reserves for an insect right before he steps on it. Sheriff Higgins, Ethan said. His voice echoed off the false fronts of the buildings, a commanding, wealthy baritone that had commanded boardrooms and brokered empires. You are a long way from the county seat. Does Mayor Thomas know you are acting as a private debt collector? Higgins blinked, staring at the man. Recognition slowly dawned on his face, followed immediately by a sickly pale terror. He took a step backwards, nearly tripping over his own spurs. Mr. Cole, Higgins stuttered. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers across the street. The name hit the town like a physical blow. Cole, the Pine Hollow mining syndicate. The man who owned the timber mills, the silver veins, the freight lines. He was a myth in this town. A ghost who lived above the clouds and signed their paychecks. Rex's face went entirely slack. The sneer melted into stupid, blank shock. Cole. No, you are a beggar. You were eating slop out of a tin bowl. I was eating a meal bought by the only decent person in this valley, Ethan corrected. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a thick stack of banknotes tied with a silk ribbon. He tossed it casually. It hit Rex in the chest and fell into the snow. There is $500, Dalton. That covers Miss Harper's debt, the interest, and the inconvenience of having to look at your face. Ethan took a step forward, closing the distance. The mountain man aggression bled through the tailored suit. Now let us talk about your debts. You owe the Pine Hollow Bank $4,000 on your cattle herd. I bought that bank this morning at 8 o'clock. I am calling the loan in. Rex scrambled backward. You cannot do that. We have terms. Read the fine print. I can call it whenever I deem the borrower a financial risk. You are a risk, Rex. You have 24 hours to produce $4,000, or I seize your ranch, your cattle, and the horse you rode in on. Ethan's voice dropped cold and lethal. I told you I would dismantle you. I keep my promises. Run. Rex looked at his men. They were already backing their horses away. They did not work for men who picked fights with Ethan Cole. Rex looked down at the money in the snow, leaving it there as he turned and practically sprinted to his mount. He spurred the horse, brutally galloping out of town in a flurry of white powder. Higgins tipped his hat, frantically murmured a terrified apology, and scurried after him. The crowd across the street dispersed rapidly, terrified of catching the billionaire's eye. Within seconds, the street was entirely empty, leaving only the carriage, the snow, and the two of them. Ethan turned back to Laura. He expected relief. He expected shock. He had slain the dragon. He had saved the castle. Laura was staring at him, her face completely drained of color. She looked at his polished boots. She looked at the silver chain. She looked at his clean hands. Laura. Ethan started taking a step up the stairs. Stop! The word cracked like a whip. Ethan froze. Laura picked up her satchel. Her hands were shaking violently now, but her eyes were dry. The amber burned with a devastating, quiet fury. You owned the mountain, she whispered, piecing the horror of it together. You owned the timber. You had money in your pockets the whole time. I did not want to buy you, Ethan said, his chest tightening. Panic, hot and unfamiliar, flared in his throat. Every woman I ever met looked at my bank accounts. I needed to know who you were when I had nothing. I needed to know you were real. You needed to know who I was. Laura let out a breathless, broken laugh. You sat at my stove. You watched me cry over a $10 shortage. You watched me starve, Ethan. You ate my food when I had nothing left to give, just to see if I was good enough for you. I was going to pay you back. I was going to give you everything. You lied to me. She stepped down from the porch, forcing him to step back into the snow to avoid touching her. You let me think you were freezing. You let me pity you. You let me risk Rex's wrath because I thought you were defenseless. Ethan, please. I was worried you were going to die in the snow this morning. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, echoing off the empty buildings. I woke up and I thought you were dead, and you were up on your mountain putting on a suit, getting ready to play God. Ethan stood paralyzed. The brilliant, masterfully executed plan crumbled to ash in his hands. He had not tested her virtue. He had exploited her empathy. He had taken the last pure thing she possessed, her kindness, and weaponized it against her for his own peace of mind. I love you. Ethan said the words desperate and raw. Laura stopped. She looked at him, and the anger drained away, leaving only a profound, crushing exhaustion. No, you do not, she said softly. You love that I passed your test. You do not love me, Mr. Cole. Because if you did, you never would have let me suffer just to prove a point. She turned her back on him, gripping her leather satchel, and began walking down the snow-packed road, heading away from the boarding house, away from the carriage, and away from the mountain. Ethan Cole stood in the freezing mud, a millionaire with the world at his fingertips, realizing he had just bankrupted his soul. Silence swallowed the estate on the ridge. Ethan stood before the massive hearth in his study, staring into a fire that offered no warmth. Mahogany paneled the walls. Persian rugs muffled his heavy steps. Everything in the room was imported, flawless, and utterly worthless. He held a crystal glass of expensive bourbon, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. It was the exact color of her eyes, right before she walked away in the snow. He threw the glass into the hearth. It shattered, sending a violent hiss of flame up the chimney. He had spent the first week systematically destroying Rex Dalton. He bought the man's debts, foreclosed the sprawling ranch, and ran Rex out of the territory with nothing but the shirt on his back. He had Sheriff Higgins stripped of his badge and exiled from the county, but revenge tasted like ash. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Laura standing on the porch, her face hollowed out by his betrayal. She had not asked him to save her. She had asked him not to die. Gideon, a private investigator with a face like tanned leather, stood in the doorway of the study. He did not flinch at the shattering glass. He just held a small battered notebook in his scarred hands. Found her, Mr. Cole. Ethan turned, his chest tightening so hard it hurt to breathe. Where? 50 miles east, Gideon replied, stepping into the room. Railroad expansion camp. Hell on earth, if you pardon my French. Place called Iron Creek. She took a job washing for the track-laying crew, 60 men. She sleeps in a canvas tent and works 18 hours a day boiling lye and scrubbing mud. Bile rose in Ethan's throat. He had vast sums of money sitting in iron safes. He could buy the railroad company by noon tomorrow. He could build her a mansion at the end of the line and pave the road with silver. But the memory of her words pinned him to the floor. You let me suffer just to prove a point. If he showed up with a carriage and a deed, she would spit in his face. She did not want his empire. His empire was the very weapon he had used to deceive her. I can arrange a private coach, Gideon offered, misreading the heavy silence. Have her brought back, or send a courier with a bank draft anonymous-like. She would not have to know it was you. She would send it back, Ethan murmured, staring down at his clean, soft hands. He had played a poor man to see if she was worthy of his wealth. He had been asking the wrong question entirely. The real question was whether he was worthy of her poverty. He walked over to his massive oak desk, pulling out a stack of thick legal documents. He dipped a brass pen into an inkwell and began to write. He wrote letters of transfer, placing his mines, his timber mills, and his banks into an irrevocable blind trust administered by his board of directors. He signed away his access to the vaults. He stripped himself of the armor he had worn for a decade. Gideon watched his brow furrowing in genuine alarm. "So what exactly are you doing?" "Resigning," Ethan said flatly. He stood up, shucking his tailored suit jacket and tossing it onto the leather chair. He walked to his closet and bypassed the fine wools and imported silks, reaching for a pair of thick canvas work trousers and a faded flannel shirt. "Mr. Cole, you cannot be serious. You own the mountain. You own half the territory, and it cost me the only thing I ever actually wanted," Ethan said, pulling on a pair of unpolished steel-toed work boots. He did not pack a bag. He did not take a single gold coin. He grabbed a heavy canvas coat and walked past the detective. "Tell the board I am gone. Do not look for me." Winter clung stubbornly to the eastern plains, turning the railroad camp at Iron Creek into a freezing mud-slicked purgatory. Laura stood over a cast-iron cauldron, stirring boiling water and lye with a heavy wooden paddle. Steam billowed into the gray sky, coating her face in a thin, greasy film. Her shoulders screamed in protest. Her hands were wrapped in torn strips of cotton, cracked and bleeding from the harsh chemicals and the bitter wind. It was brutal, unforgiving work. Men fought, drank, and bled on the tracks, but nobody lied to her here. The track boss paid her exactly what he promised, $3 a week, and the laborers treated her with a gruff, distant respect. She was entirely self-reliant. The physical pain in her muscles was a strange comfort, grounding her in reality, keeping her mind from drifting back to the mountains and the ghost of a man who had never existed. Morning broke over the camp with a harsh, metallic cold. Laura needed fresh water for the day's wash. She grabbed 2 heavy wooden buckets and trudged toward the creek at the edge of the camp. The mud was frozen solid, crunching violently beneath her thin, worn boots. Ice had sealed the creek overnight, thick and cloudy. She set the buckets down and picked up a heavy iron splitting bar left near the bank. She raised it, preparing to drive it down into the ice, but a shadow fell over her. A hand caught the iron bar mid-swing. Thick, calloused fingers wrapped around the cold metal. Laura gasped, stepping back, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Ethan stood there. He was not wearing a tailored broadcloth suit. He wore a canvas coat stained with grease and dirt. His face was weathered, hollowed out by exhaustion, and a week's worth of dark stubble covered his jaw. He did not look like a millionaire playing dress-up. He looked like a man who had walked 50 miles through the freezing snow. Laura's breath hitched. Anger, hot and immediate, flared in her chest. "Get away from me." Ethan did not argue. He did not offer a charming smile or flash a silver pocket watch. He simply took the iron bar, raised it high, and drove it down into the creek. The ice shattered with a deafening crack. He struck it again and again, until a large pool of freezing black water was exposed. He set the bar aside, picked up her wooden buckets, and plunged them into the icy water. "I told you to leave me alone," Laura said, her voice shaking, though she was not sure if it was from rage or the sight of his hollow, exhausted eyes. "Did you come in your private train car? Have your men set up a luxury tent over the ridge so you can watch me suffer again?" Ethan pulled the heavy buckets from the water, the muscles in his forearms bunching under the strain. He set them gently at her feet. "I walked," Ethan said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by the cold and the silence. "I do not have a train car. I do not have a carriage. I signed the company over to the board. I do not have access to a single vault." Laura stared at him, refusing to believe a single word. Another lie, another grand test. "No tests," Ethan said, softly, stepping back to give her space. "I was a coward, Laura. I was so terrified of being used that I used you instead. I treated your heart like a ledger, and I bankrupted myself. I did not come here to buy your forgiveness. I do not have a dime in my pockets to buy it with, even if I wanted to." She crossed her arms, shivering in the biting wind. "Then why are you here?" "To drive spikes." Ethan pointed toward the railhead 1/2 mile down the valley, where men were already swinging sledgehammers against the iron rails. "Track boss hired me this morning, 10 hours a day. I sleep in the bunkhouse with the crew." Laura scoffed a bitter, disbelieving sound. "You last 2 days, maybe." Ethan agreed quietly. "But I will be here. I will carry your water every morning. I will chop your wood every night. I will not ask you for a word, and I will not ask you for a smile. You do not ever have to look at me if you do not want to. But I am going to show you that the man who sat by your stove was not a lie. That man is who I want to be, and I will spend the rest of my life breaking my back on this railroad to prove it to you." He tipped his head slightly, respectfully, and turned away. He did not linger to beg. He did not demand an answer. He just walked toward the railhead, his boots sinking into the freezing mud, joining the line of laborers moving towards the tracks. Laura watched him go. Her mind screamed that it was a trick, an elaborate game played by a bored tycoon. But she looked down at the buckets of water. They were full. He had broken the ice so she would not have to freeze her hands. For the next month, Ethan became a ghost made of sweat and iron. Every morning before dawn, Laura would find her water buckets already full sitting outside her tent. Every evening, a fresh cord of chopped wood would appear near her wash cauldrons. She watched him from a distance. She saw him swinging the 10-pound sledgehammer, driving iron spikes into the wooden ties. She saw him falter his body, unaccustomed to the relentless, back-breaking brutality after years behind a mahogany desk. She saw his hands bleed. He never approached her. He never spoke to her. When they passed each other in the muddy avenues of the camp, he kept his eyes on the ground, granting her total peace. Rumors trickled through the camp. The men whispered about the new spike driver. They said he was crazy. They said he gave away his meager weekly pay to a crippled miner in the next town. They said he fought a gang of gamblers who tried to cheat a young laborer out of his wages, taking a vicious beating, but refusing to back down until the money was returned. He was earning their respect not with a checkbook, but with blood grit and silence. Laura's anger began to lose its sharp edge, wearing down like a stone in a river. She remembered the man who had choked Rex Dalton to protect her. She remembered the quiet nights whittling by the stove, the genuine smile that reached his eyes. She realized with a terrifying, heart-stopping clarity that Ethan was not pretending anymore. The millionaire was dead. The mountain man had remained. Spring finally cracked the frost. The mud softened and small green shoots pushed through the gray, punishing earth. Laura stood at her washboard, scrubbing a heavy canvas shirt. She paused, wiping the sweat from her brow, and looked towards the railhead. Ethan was hauling a massive iron rail with 3 other men. His face was streaked with soot, his shirt soaked through with sweat. As they dropped the rail, Ethan stumbled, catching himself on his knees. He did not get up immediately. He just knelt in the dirt, breathing heavily, completely exhausted, his head bowed under the midday sun. Laura dried her hands slowly on her apron. She could not watch him break himself anymore. It was not pity that moved her feet. It was a profound, aching realization that a man who would throw away an empire for a chance to carry her water was a man who knew the true value of a soul. She picked up a tin cup, dipped it into her clean water bucket, and started walking toward the tracks. Iron rang against iron, a deafening rhythm that vibrated up through the soles of Laura's boots. She walked past the flatbed cars loaded with creosote-soaked ties, ignoring the stares of the exhausted crew. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, turning the muddy trench of the railhead into a baking oven. Ethan was still on his knees by the tracks. He was breathing in slow, ragged pulls, staring at the ground as if trying to memorize the shape of the gravel. His thick canvas shirt clung to his back, dark with sweat. He did not hear her approach over the roar of the foreman shouting further down the line. Laura stopped beside him. She looked down at the man who had once terrified a town with a whisper. He looked battered. He looked broken. He looked completely human. She held out the tin cup. Ethan saw the hem of her faded skirt first. He went entirely still. Slowly, he lifted his head. His face was smeared with ash and grease. His lips cracked from the dry wind. He looked at the cup, then up at her face, his dark eyes wide with a quiet, terrified reverence. He did not reach for the water. He seemed afraid that if he moved, the mirage would shatter. "Take it," Laura said. Her voice was firm, carrying over the clatter of the work camp. "Before I pour it over your head," Ethan reached up. His hand was shaking. His knuckles were swollen, the skin split and scarred from the punishing weight of the sledgehammer. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was rougher than it had been in Pine Hollow, stripped of all the softness his wealth had afforded him. He drank the water in 3 long swallows. He lowered the cup, letting out a breath that sounded like a prayer. "Thank you," he rasped his voice, barely audible over the wind. "You are going to kill yourself out here, Ethan," she said flatly. She did not offer a gentle smile. She was not ready to let him off the hook, but she could not watch him die to prove a point. "You do not belong on a rail crew. You are a man who signs papers. You are not built to drive spikes 10 hours a day." Ethan slowly got to his feet. He was inches taller than her, but he kept his shoulders hunched, deliberately making himself smaller, giving her all the power in the narrow space between them. "I was not built to lie to you either," Ethan said, wiping his mouth with the back of his bruised hand. "But I did. The work here, it is honest. A spike goes into the wood or it does not. There is no manipulation, no leverage, just the swing and the strike." "And what happens when winter comes back?" Laura challenged, crossing her arms. "What happens when your back gives out or you shatter your knee? You just send a telegram to Denver and have your board of directors unlock your vaults." Ethan looked at her steadily. The ambient noise of the camp seemed to drop away, leaving only the fierce amber heat of her stare and the absolute certainty in his chest. "There are no vaults, Laura." She frowned. "Do not play word games with me." "I signed it away," Ethan said quietly. He did not brag. He stated it like a man describing the weather, the mines, the timber, the bank. "I put it all into an irrevocable trust. I do not own it anymore. I have no access to it. Even if I wanted to pull a dime from those accounts, I legally cannot. The only money I have in this world is the $3 the track boss pays me every Friday." Laura stared at him. The sheer magnitude of what he was saying crashed over her. Men killed for a fraction of what Ethan Cole had possessed. Kings waged wars for less, and he had simply signed his name and walked away. "You threw away an empire," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "For what? Because you felt guilty?" "I threw away a cage," Ethan corrected. He took a half step forward, his dark eyes burning with an intense, desperate clarity. "The money made me paranoid. It made me arrogant. It made me look at the only woman who ever treated me like a human being and treat her like a variable in an equation. I did not want the empire if it meant I had to sit in that mansion and remember the look on your face when you realized I lied to you." He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently wrapping his calloused fingers around her wrists. He did not pull her close. He just held on, grounding himself. "I do not have a carriage," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I cannot buy back your boarding house. I cannot pave your road with silver. All I have is 2 hands and a strong back. But they are yours. If you want me to leave, I will pack my roll tonight and walk west. You will never see my face again. But if you let me stay, I will spend the rest of my days making sure you never carry a heavy load alone." Laura looked down at his hands, holding her wrists. They were ruined, blistered, split, and scarred. They were the hands of a man who had finally earned his life in the dirt. She remembered the freezing night in Pine Hollow, the way he had stepped between her and Rex's cruelty. She remembered the perfectly stacked firewood, the patched roof, the quiet presence near the stove. The millionaire had lied to her, but the man holding her wrists right now, the man who had broken the ice in the creek every morning for a month without asking for a single word in return, that man was real. Laura slowly uncrossed her arms. She turned her hands over and laced her fingers through his. "You do not chop the wood right," she said softly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "You cut the kindling too thick. It chokes the stove." Ethan let out a broken, breathless laugh. He dropped his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as relief washed over him like a physical wave. "Teach me." "I will," Laura promised, her voice steady and warm. "But you are quitting this rail crew today. I am not nursing you back to health when you inevitably drop a steel rail on your foot." "Yes, ma'am." 3 years passed. The iron tracks stretched further west, leaving the muddy camp of Iron Creek to dissolve back into the wilderness. Ethan and Laura did not follow the railroad. They pulled their meager savings, the wages she earned over the washboard and the silver coins he saved from driving spikes, and bought a small, rocky parcel of land in a forgotten valley 50 miles south. It was not a mansion on a ridge. It was a one-room cabin built from pine logs Ethan felled himself. The roof did not leak because Ethan spent 2 weeks meticulously sealing the pitch. The porch did not sag because he sank the footings deep into the bedrock. They ran a small freight stop. It was brutal, endless work. Laura cooked for the stagecoach drivers passing through the valley, serving heavy stews and fresh-baked bread. Ethan handled the teams swapping out exhausted horses, mending broken axles, and hauling feed. They were perpetually tired, their clothes perpetually smelling of wood smoke and horse sweat. But there was a profound, unshakable peace in the valley. Nobody knew the name Ethan Cole here. To the drivers and the transient ranchers, he was just Ethan. A quiet, massive man who could lift a wagon wheel single-handedly and who looked at his wife like she hung the stars in the sky. Evening fell over the valley, painting the sky in deep, bruised purples and burnt orange. The last stagecoach of the day had rolled out an hour prior. The horses were brushed and fed. The kitchen was scrubbed clean. Ethan sat on the front porch of the cabin. He had a piece of soft cedar in his hands, slowly whittling a small figure with a sharp pocket knife. His boots were scuffed, his canvas trousers patched at the knees. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the sun and the wind. The screen door squeaked open. Laura stepped out carrying 2 steaming ceramic mugs. She wore a simple cotton dress, her hair pinned up loosely, strands escaping to frame her face. She looked tired, but her amber eyes were bright and content. She handed him a mug and sat down on the wooden bench beside him. Ethan set his knife aside and took the coffee, leaning back against the log wall. "We made a profit this month," Laura said, resting her head against his shoulder. $18 clear after feed and supplies." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We are practically tycoons." Laura chuckled, the sound warm and low in the quiet air. "Do not let it go to your head. The roof on the barn needs patching before the snow hits." "I will start tomorrow," Ethan promised. He took a sip of the bitter black coffee. He looked out over the property. The split-rail fence he had built by hand. The small garden Laura had coaxed out of the stubborn dirt. The smoke curling lazily from their chimney. He thought about the massive estate in Pine Hollow. He thought about the silk suits, the crystal glasses, the ledgers filled with millions of dollars that he had signed away without a second thought. A younger version of himself would have looked at this dirty, exhausted man on a sagging porch and felt pity. but Ethan had never felt richer. He had everything a man could ever need, sitting right beside him, leaning against his shoulder. He had not bought her loyalty. He had not tested her grace. They had forged this life together, hammer blow by hammer blow, out of the dirt and the grit of the frontier. "What are you thinking about?" Laura asked, turning her head to look up at him. "Just thinking about the wood." Ethan smiled, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of lye soap and fresh flour. "I cut the kindling thin today, just like you showed me." Laura smiled, closing her eyes as the last light of the sun dipped below the mountain ridge. "You are learning, mountain man. You are learning." If you felt the grit and heart of Ethan and Laura's story, do not let it end here. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who understands that real love is not bought. It is built in the dirt. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on more deeply human Wild West tales of redemption and grit. Drop a comment below and tell us, would you have given up an empire for true love? Let us know what you want to see next. Thanks for listening, and we will see you on the frontier.